Good evening. Christ is risen. Indeed, he is risen. And this evening we're going to do part 2 of my book, Looking to Tomorrow, the History and Mission of the Byzantine Catholic Church. And I'm just going to go right into it, and we have an hour, and that's a lot of material. Although this part is not as much time frame as the last one. The last one was from 800 AD to 1945, and this one is just 1945 to 2024. So that's a lot more manageable. But it also is an era where so much happens. So we have the martyrdom in Eastern Europe, the Greek Catholic Church driven underground and people forced into the Russian Orthodox Church. We have the reduction of the Greek Catholic Church in other parts of Eastern Europe, in Hungary and Yugoslavia. They're restricted just to worship, even though they weren't driven underground, but they were under so many restrictions. And then the dramatic changes in the mid-20th century, late 20th century in the United States that really affected our church a lot because of the growth of suburbs, the white flight that took place in the 1960s, and then the sudden expansion of the Byzantine Catholic Church into the West and into the South. And also in the 60s, Vatican Council II. And one of the big things of Vatican Council II was that there's full official acceptance of Eastern Catholics as equals to the Roman Catholics in church statements. And the establishment of the metropolitan province of the United States, and then the big challenge of today. So that's where we're going. So the expansion of communism, because of World War II, the Soviets violated the agreement of the United Nations, which was that all countries were supposed to be restored. And so they annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 1940 and claimed those people voted to join, which they were forced in. Part of Germany was taken by the Soviet Union and annexed to Russia. And then Poland lost 1/3 of its territory. Germany lost 1/3 of its territory to compensate Poland for what it lost. And communist governments were established in Poland, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all of the republics of Yugoslavia, and then the People's Republic of Albania. So all of this territory launched persecutions of religion. And in Czechoslovakia, the Byzantine Catholic, the Greek Catholic Church, was driven completely underground. In Poland, the Greek Catholics were scattered all over the western and northern part of the country. In Hungary and Yugoslavia, the church was allowed to exist, but almost just barely. And then Romania, the Greek Catholic Church, was also driven underground. And Bulgaria, a very limited existence. And the Roman Catholics suffered tremendously as well in all of these territories, and then even in the Soviet Union it was very, very bad. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was underground. The Ruthenian Church here was driven underground, and in Belarus as well. So communism brought a lot of suffering into Eastern Europe and a lot of grief to so many millions of people, which Americans, unfortunately, have a short memory when it comes to history. And that's really important to remember, just how bad things were for people. So, why did the Russian Orthodox collaborate with the Soviet government? This is one of the interesting things. In the Soviet Union and in Czechoslovakia, and also in Romania, the Romanian Orthodox did the same thing. But in Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, the Greek Catholics were forced into an underground existence. Why? Because the Russian Orthodox had been legalized with a new patriarch during World War II, and they collaborated with the communist government, even though it was atheistic and hostile to religion, in order to survive. They thought this would be a good way to solve several problems. One, to destroy the so-called uniate churches once and for all and eliminate them as rivals to orthodoxy. and to do so with state power, as had been done in the Russian Empire in the 1830s and 1870s. Secondly, they took over all of the national Orthodox churches in Czechoslovakia, the 3 Baltic states, in Poland. All of those came under the Moscow Patriarchs, expanded the Moscow Patriarchate dramatically. And Stalin wanted the Moscow Patriarchate in Moscow to become the new Orthodox Vatican. That was his phrasing. It fulfilled the dreams of Moscow, both the communists and the Orthodox, of pushing back Western ideas out of the country, because the Catholics were very West-oriented in terms of human rights, in terms of church structure, in terms of people's activities, and trying to stay current with theology. The cooperation would hopefully guarantee the lessening of state persecution of the Orthodox. That never happened. So they totally failed in that, because Orthodox were persecuted and limited and restricted in all of the communist countries. Nowhere did they have full freedom. And we see that now, the results of that, in low church attendance in so many parts of Eastern Europe and Russia. And then a fulfillment of the communist ideology, which denied the Rusin identity, and the fulfillment of Russian nationalist ideology regarding the Ukrainians and dominating all Slavic nations. And what is that? The Rusin population in Podkarpatska Rus, Subcarpathian Rus, which is now the Transcarpathian Oblast of Ukraine, they had been denied the right to exist by Lenin himself back in the 1920s. Russian nationalist ideology is not only that the Rusins don't exist as a people, but Ukrainians do not exist as a people, nor do the Belarusians. And that's what we see with the war now in Ukraine. The goal of Russia is not just to conquer Ukraine, but to eliminate Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian churches, Ukrainian history. Because in the communist ideology, the Russians are the great brother, the big brother, and Veliki Brat, that they are the big brother of all the Slavic nations, and that they should dominate all Slavic nations. And that ideology affected how they looked at the Orthodox in Poland, how they looked at the Orthodox in Estonia and in Latvia and in Czechoslovakia. So they had their reasons for collaborating. The big problem with this history is that they have never apologized for what they did in destroying the Ukrainian Greek Catholics, the Ukrainian Orthodox, the Ruthenian Greek Catholics, and taking over all these national churches. Okay, so Bishop Ramja was consecrated in the last year of the war at the age of 33. And he became the apostolic administrator of the Eparchy Mukachevo, the mother diocese of our church, which in 1945, that whole territory of Subcarpathian Rus was annexed into Soviet Ukraine. They were promised that they would have an autonomous territory, but that was never granted. It's just a regular oblast of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. He consecrated 2 secret bishops that we know of in December of 44. Petro Oros. So Blessed Petro Oros was 27 when Ramja made him a bishop. There were very few celibate priests in the Greek Catholic Church in Czechoslovakia or in the Transcarpathian Oblast. So the Russians, the Soviets, were always looking at celibate priests as potential bishops. But they figured because he was so young, he had just been ordained a couple of years before, that they would never suspect Petro Oros, which is true, they did not. And then he also, that's Czechoslovakia, he also consecrated a second bishop, Alexander Hira. That's the one the Russians thought was the leader of the church. And that's the one that they went after. He was an older priest. He was a well-respected priest. He was very well thought of. In 1947, Ramja was in a carriage, horse-drawn carriage, with a priest and 2 seminarians. They went for the dedication of a church that had redone its interior in the village called Lavki. And as they were coming back, they were saying the rosary, and they noticed an American truck that had been sent by the Americans during World War II to help fight the Nazis. This truck was following them, and if the carriage went one way, the truck went the other way, back and forth across the road, and then it sped up, smashed into the carriage so fast that it went through the entire carriage and killed the horses. And all of the people and the coachmen were thrown out into the road, and all these Red Army soldiers jumped out armed with iron rods, and they started beating them. And one of the seminarians got away and ran for help to Ivanovci, the next village. And fortunately, the mail truck was late, and the mail truck came around the bend of the road upon this terrible scene, and then the soldiers got back in their truck and took off. I interviewed one of the seminarians, Father Masli, in Slovakia, and he said he never saw so much blood in his entire life. He never saw anything like the butchery that these soldiers did. And they broke Bishop Ramja's jaws, and they broke his rib cage. And the beating was so severe. He was operated on in the hospital, but Stalin sent a secret agent into the hospital, and she murdered him in his bed with an injection of poison, which we still see today. You know, the Russians do that still, killing political opponents with poison. So Ramja was buried in red vestments, which is really important because when they buried him, they dressed him in the red vestments, and the Soviets came to the priests and said, "You have to bury him in white vestments. Don't you believe in the resurrection?" And he said, "He's a martyr. We know what happened. He's being buried in red." And the Soviets understood that they were making a statement, and they tried to change it, and they wouldn't budge. And so the big funeral was held, and as far as the people and most of the priests knew, the eparchy was now leaderless. Father Nicholas Murani took over the leadership, but Bishop Hira was in the background. When the church was completely suppressed in 1949, and by that point a number of priests had been murdered, and a number of people had been persecuted and arrested and sent to the Gulag. In 49, the church was completely suppressed, and you had to sign to become Orthodox, or they would arrest you. And Bishop Oros took several priests up into the Carpathian Mountains, and they started the underground movement of our church. And they all had the same dream. They were living in a cabin together, and they all had the same dream. They got up in the morning and started to tell each other the dream they had, where Bishop Ramja came to each of them and told them, "Do what you have to do, have no fear." Because they had been discussing, how are we going to have liturgy? How are we going to do sacraments without churches? And when they all realized they'd had the exact same dream, they all said, "Well, that's a sign from God." And so they started offering liturgy in the woods and in barns and in private homes, and that continued until 1990. Under Oros's leadership. Oros was wanted by the government, and in 1953, he had held a big service in a village for the Feast of the Dormition, and he and a lady traveling with him, because they wouldn't be looking for a couple, were getting ready to board the train, and someone recognized him and reported him to the police, and a militiaman came, took him, and shot him in the knees, and then shot him in the head and killed him. And before he died, he told the woman traveling with him, Catherine Stanko, that he had liturgy intentions in his pocket and to get them to a priest. And when they opened the paper, the last intention was for the soul of Petro Oros. He knew he was going to die. So it's quite a story of what happens afterwards. With him. So these two are, really looked upon as, the ones that helped the church to survive. And something I said the last time, but it's worth repeating today, all of the priests that I interviewed who had been ordained by Ramja or were in the seminary under Ramja said to me that if you met Blessed Theodore Ramja, you had met Jesus Christ. And that I said that is quite the epitaph to have, to be remembered like that. And Pedro Oros was really known as the father of the poor. He was deeply loved. So their ministry was very successful, even though it was short. All right, in Czechoslovakia, the communists took over in 1948. The two bishops, Blessed Paul Peter Gojdich on the right, who was also a Basilian monk, which is why he has that collar on, and Blessed Basil Hopko was the auxiliary bishop. He was the ordinary, the Bishop of Prešov. They were both arrested when the church was finally completely suppressed in 1950. The Jewish people that Blessed Paul Peter Gojdich rescued were leaving Czechoslovakia because of the communists. And they begged him to come with them and go to Israel, and that they could get him an exit visa. And he refused, and he stayed behind in order to be with his flock. They consecrated several priests as clandestine bishops to lead an underground church. And they both were put in prison. They were both tortured. Blessed Basil Hopko was prevented from sleeping for weeks on end. The deprivation of sleep is such that they wanted to break him so that he would sign to break with the Holy See, and he would not break at all. And then Blessed Paul Peter Gojdich was tortured and also would not break with the Holy See. He was moved around from prison to prison. He was moved 23 times. But people always found out which prison he was in, and then they would stand outside and they would sing Greek Catholic hymns in Slovak and Rusin and Church Slavonic, so that he would know that they were praying for him. As for the churches were all given over to the Russian Orthodox Church of Czechoslovakia, which was now under the Patriarch of Moscow. There were a few priests who apostatized and joined the Orthodox Church. A couple of them did so for career advancement and became bishops. A number of them did so because the villagers in their parishes asked them to sign, but those parishes remained Catholic in heart. And when the church was partially legalized in the Prague Spring in 1968, those parishes became the core of the restoration of the Greek Catholic Church. But he was dead by then. He had cancer and died. But he had prayed that he would die on his birthday, which it happened, and that there would be a priest brought to the infirmary to absolve him, and that also happened. Blessed Basil was finally released from prison and sent to a concentration monastery. It was filled with nuns from several different orders, Roman Catholic orders, because all of the nuns and all of the monks in the country, Roman and Byzantine, had been arrested and were put in these concentration monasteries and forced to do heavy labor. But the nuns nursed him and took care of him. They called him their golden man, and he was able to minister to them using Ukrainian and Rusin and German and Hungarian and Slovak. He knew all those languages and helped all of these sisters from those different nationalities, and served until in 1968, those concentration camps were finally closed, and he was able to return to Eastern Slovakia to try and rebuild the church. All right, this is the third bishop, Alexander Hira. He was arrested and sent to the Gulag. He worked in coal mines, mostly in Kazakhstan. And he became, after he was released from prison, they allowed him to go home briefly, and then they realized he was taking over the leadership of the underground church, and so they rearrested him, sent him back to Kazakhstan, and he was only allowed to go home every year for 2 weeks and make a visit home. And so he spent his time working secretly, illegally, as a missionary throughout the Central Asian republics and in Siberia among Roman Catholic and Greek Catholic exiles. So he ministered to Germans, Poles, Ukrainians, Ruthenians, Lithuanians, Latvians. I mean, an enormous Catholic diaspora existed in Central Asia and Southern Siberia. And he went all over the place. And he actually got permission from the Soviets after many years. They built the Church of St. Joseph in Karaganda. But it could only be a certain height. It could not have a bell tower. It couldn't have bells. And it was to be a low building, kind of like a barracks. And well, the people were upset. They wanted a nice church. And he said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to dig a hole. And they dug down. And it's a beautiful church. It's a magnificent church. They had statues imported from Poland and an organ from East Germany. And in Karaganda, it was called the Rome of the East, because you could go to Karaganda and you could find a priest at any time, because there were so many exiles there. And he helped found a secret convent, and it was really remarkable. And he lived to be very old, and lived with a Russia-German family. And when he was dying, they took him out of the hospital so he could have a church funeral. And the pictures of his funeral, you see all these priests came from all over the Soviet Union to bury him. It's just a remarkable story. Okay, so in the United States, we had Bishop Takach in the 1940s. He died in 1948. And from the 40s through the 60s was the last big push of Latinization of the Byzantine Rite in the United States. The Latin Church was seen as being superior, which it was certainly larger. It still is. You know, the largest of all the Catholic churches is the Roman Church. But it was also presumed through this saying in Latin that Rome is mater et magistra. She is the mother and teacher of all churches. That Eastern churches were automatically inferior in quality. So the Latin Church was seen as superior, not just in size, but also in theology and in ritual, all ritual, not just the Mass, but everything that was done. And there was a great desire among Eastern Catholics to be accepted as equal Catholics by the Latin majority. At the same time, after World War II, the servicemen came home. They had a lot of demands. They wanted English to be used and expanded. They wanted an end to the sermons being only in foreign languages. They wanted English in the sermons. They wanted more acceptance because they were marrying, non-Slavic and non-Hungarian women. There was a lot of conversions. There were a lot of people transferring rites that were drawn to Eastern spirituality. At the same time, in the Latinization, they thought would stop the hemorrhage. So many women and men went into Roman Catholic dioceses and Roman Catholic religious orders rather than go to our sisters or our monks or our seminary. And they created, therefore, these new rituals for Lent, for the Stations of the Cross. They created Benediction of Blessed Sacrament, devotions to the Sacred Heart, a new version of the Holy Rosary, and there was a much greater introduction of statues into churches. And several bishops over the years forced churches to tear down these beautiful icon screens that had been imported from Austria-Hungary in the 1880s and through the 1930s, and instead put in statues. Or they would build new churches without an icon screen. And this is the best example I have. I had a lady in one of my parishes. She said, I was teaching about the development, and the pastor in that parish had just put in an icon screen. And this church was deliberately built with a huge sanctuary so that with the thought that never would an icon screen be put in here. And she came to me when we had just finished putting in the screen. And she says, Father Chris, I was born in Austria-Hungary. My church had an iconostas all the way up to the ceiling, and it was beautiful. We had banners like these here in our church, and it was a beautiful church. And then I came to America, and I went to Pennsylvania, and we built a new church, and we put in iconostas up to ceiling, and we put in banners, and it was just like home, and everybody said, this is our church. And I said, this is what the Greek Catholic is. And then we got a new priest. And he took off the top part of the iconostas, and he said, this is Greek Catholic. And I said, okay. And then we moved to New Jersey. I got married. We moved to New Jersey. We built a new church. We put in an iconostas. New priest came in, he took off the top of that iconostas, and he took out the banners, and he said, "This is Greek Catholic." And I said, "Okay." And then another priest came in, and he put statues in front of the iconostas, and he said, "This is Greek Catholic." And I said, "Okay." And then the father came who built this new church, and he put big open church and no iconostas and no icons and statues all over, and he said, "This is Greek Catholic." And I said, "Okay." And now Father John comes and he puts in a big iconostas up to the ceiling, and he took out all the statues and he put in all the banners, and he said, "This is Greek Catholic." And I said, "You know what, Father? I think I'm Presbyterian." All of that in one lifetime. And that's very hard. It was very hard on people. And the Latinization backfired because people said, "Why should I drive past 3 Roman Catholic churches if all we are is a church with a different mass?" Which is how many priests would tell them. And so the hemorrhage was not stopped. And Roman Catholic bishops don't go into Eastern Catholic churches looking to see how Roman Catholic they look. They could care less. They have enough to do in their own dioceses. So all of this of trying to be accepted, it just didn't work. But it did a lot of damage. Long-term damage. So this is a good example. This is St. Peter and Paul in Braddock, a beautiful church, magnificent sanctuary, 3-bar cross up on top of the baldacchino over the altar. But look, it could be any Roman Catholic church in any town in the northeastern or midwestern United States. There is nothing in this church at all that says we're Eastern Catholic. There's nothing there at all. And this is very much the norm for what happened to churches. The screens are gone, and new churches were built like this. All right. Then, 1950, under Bishop Ivancho, the St. Cyril and Methodius Seminary was built. And this was a comment that was made when the church was dedicated by a Catholic theologian. He wrote that the chapel at St. Cyril and Methodius is a symbol of good things to come. It was built with a regular iconostas, with the second row of the Holy Days, and with the Last Supper, with doors in place, the baldacchino over the altar, the tabernacle on the altar, the proper side altars, Christ in glory on the back. It's a beautiful chapel and a big seminary that could hold 100 men. So this was really seen as the future, right? But the bishop who followed Ivancho, Bishop Elko, restarted the Latinization. At the same time, people were moving. We had soldiers came back. Our government had the GI Bill. They could go to school. And this was the creation of a class of Byzantine Catholics who went to work outside of the old mining and factory towns. They had a whole different future ahead of them. And so they expanded. Now, I was in Washington, D.C. at St. Gregory of Nyssa Church, and the founders of the parish told me when they got their jobs and they moved into Washington to work for the federal government or to work for the laboratories in Maryland, they went to Pittsburgh, and they went to the Bishop Elko, and they said, we need a church in Washington. All young families, all starting out. And he said, "Washington, that's too far south. Nobody's going to go there." And they said, "We already have all these families, Bishop." So they opened a church, and out of that one parish, 4 new parishes have been founded. In Los Angeles, Father Cremoga was sent out there because people were writing to Pittsburgh, "We need a priest. We have this many families. Please send us a priest." He got there. He called the first telephone number, got off the train, called the telephone number from a phone booth in Union Station. The line was disconnected. He prayed, called the second number. They're all excited. They came down the station, picked him up, took him to their house, and they started. And that is now St. Mary's Church in Los Angeles. And he founded the church in San Diego and then a steel town, Fontana. These priests were sent up to Alaska, and that's the church in Anchorage. At the same time, growth was happening outside of Cleveland and Detroit. People were moving. They wanted backyards. They wanted front yards. They wanted space. They wanted different public schools. They wanted their children to, have a different kind of neighborhood. The old neighborhoods were congested and crowded, and this whole movement out into the suburbs by young families. And it took a long time for the church to follow, which is unfortunate. And they finally did, but by that time, some people were already entrenched in Roman Catholic parishes. The priests and the bishop had this expectation that people would be willing to drive back to the old neighborhood every Sunday and stay, come to liturgy, visit in the hall, have catechism, and then go, in the old neighborhood and visit with people. Thing is, people started dying off, and old people wanted to live with their kids in the suburbs. Those neighborhoods started changing fast. And then in 1968, after all the riots, that really accelerated what became known as the White Flight. And these ethnic neighborhoods were abandoned, almost en masse, and relatively few people stayed behind. Phoenix, the people wrote for 10 years asking to get a priest. 10 years they wrote to Pittsburgh. In the 70s, they finally opened new churches in suburban Pittsburgh and around New York City, Chicago, closing the churches in the city of Chicago and starting churches further south of the city. And then in the 70s and 80s, Florida. I remember priests saying, why are we going to open a church in Florida? They're just going down there to retire and die. But those people went down as missionaries. They wrote back to Passaic, and they asked for priests to come, and they created a whole new network of parishes, and they convinced other people to follow them, younger people to follow them. They convinced people to come, check out my church. It was a lot of self-evangelization that they did on their own. And the new parishes that expanded in the 70s, why we are having our 50th this year. So many new churches were opened in California. Denver, the church had been closed for decades. There had not been a parish in Colorado, but there were still people there, and who connected with new Byzantine Catholics. And again, writing to the bishop, we need a priest. Same thing happened here in Albuquerque. We need a priest. And then finally, the Holy See created the Eparchy of Van Nuys, based in Los Angeles in 1982. And in the 80s, more churches in Virginia, in Georgia, in North Carolina, and across Texas. So just this phenomenal national growth where people were willing to make great sacrifices to have a parish. They were persistent in telling the bishops that they wanted a parish and they wanted a priest. And there were priests who were willing to do this, who would fly out once a month, twice a month, and meet with these people. And we have churches now in the greater part of the United States. So in 1969, the Holy See created the Metropolitan Province under the Archeparchy of Munhall. Munhall is a suburb of Pittsburgh, and that's where the cathedral is, St. John's. There were 80 parishes with 94 priests, 140,000 faithful. Passaic is the east coast of the United States. Also had 80 parishes, 92 priests, 100,000 faithful. The Eparchy of Parma was founded with 53 parishes, 60 priests, 85,000 faithful. So Munhall was Pennsylvania, part of Ohio, and then going down to Texas. Parma was from Cleveland, the center of Ohio, west to Alaska. And a nice small diocese. And the bishop in Parma, when all these churches were being founded in the western states, he finally wrote to Rome. And he basically said, America is a very big country. I cannot minister to all of these territories well. And so that's how the Eparchy of Van Nuys got founded out here. And that's when I came out here, was when the Eparchy was founded. All right, so parishes, it's important to know, included filiali. They included filial churches served as missions from the mother parish. Priests included diocesan clergy. The priests here in our parish were all diocesan clergy, secular clergy. But they also were Franciscan and Benedictine Hiero monks, all right, monks who were ordained priests, and they also had brothers. And there were monasteries of men. The Basilian Fathers in Matawan, they were refugees from Hungary. the Franciscan Fathers in Cybertsville, the Benedictines in Butler, and then there were individuals who joined these Roman Catholic orders. Jesuits, Salesians, the Redemptorists had a small vice province for a time. And then the sisters, our main sisters, the Sisters of St. Basil the Great, the Basilians. Bishop Kosciuszko founded a new community, Sisters of Christ the Teacher. The Sisters of St. Benedict had a couple of Byzantine nuns. They opened a new convent and a school. Poor Clare nuns also had a couple of Byzantine members that are strictly cloistered. They opened a new convent. And then the Carmelites had a couple of Byzantine nuns, and they opened a monastery in Pennsylvania under the direction of Father Walter Chiswick, the famous missionary, the priest who was a missionary in the Soviet Union for many years. So the ones that are in red, though, those communities are extinct. They don't exist anymore. They've died out, which is, it's a terrible shame because it's a great loss. So all we have now are the cloistered Carmelites in Pennsylvania who are modifying their rule, but they're flourishing. Our Sisters of St. Basil, who have not had a new candidate in several years, quite a while. The Franciscans have one house, and that's it. All right, so these two men were appointed after Bishop Elko was removed. Bishop Elko was not very popular, and he was taken to Rome. And Bishop Kosciuszko became the bishop in Pittsburgh, and Bishop Dudek was named in Passaic, and then Bishop Mahalik was named for Parma. These guys stopped the Latinization. They did a really good job of that. They did a good job, because I lived through all of this. They started the catechetical congresses, bringing sisters, lay people, and priests together. We would have a couple hundred people at a time all over the country. And it was awesome going through books and materials and what are we doing in our parishes? What are your ideas that I could learn from? It was really, really exciting. They had a nice, slow, carefully paced restoration of traditional worship and dropping the Latinizations of Presanctified, the Akathis, Malevins. And they just did a very nice job of reintroducing things and cleaning things up and putting in icon screens. And why? Because people had this hammered at them to get rid of all these things that were too Eastern. When I was a seminarian, you could not grow a beard. That was too Eastern. You were going to become Orthodox if you had a beard. So I teased Father Artur and Father Tyler. So I still can't, that was drilled into me, no beards. The last priest with a beard was in 1832. I was okay. You do know this is 1980. Rapid expansion of English, putting out English books for all of these services. Start in the 50s, big expansion. Bishop Fulton Sheen celebrated Byzantine Rite liturgies in English at the pilgrimages in Pennsylvania. And he had bi-ritual faculties, and it was just, he really put us on the map. And he would go all over the country celebrating the Byzantine liturgy in English. So they revised the chant. They introduced Spanish in Miami. A lot of Cuban exiles who fled to Florida joined our parish, loved the Byzantine Rite. And a slow restoration of the fasting. When I started going to Byzantine church, it was just abstinence on Fridays. That was it. This took a long time to get to the point where we are now of a better understanding of ascetical life. And then creating the catechetical program and publication of books for Matins and Vespers by the Sisters of St. Basil. So it was this huge, huge work that was done under Bishop Kosciuszko and Bishop Dudek. And at this time is also the creation of all these new parishes. And so these parishes, many of them started out English only, and all of them started out with mixed populations. All right, so Vatican II. When Vatican II was held, John the 23rd had worked in Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. He had very good relations with the Orthodox, and he had very good relations with the Eastern Catholic communities in those countries. And he really developed a sensitivity and love for the Eastern Catholic churches. And he went way beyond what he needed to do when he was nuncio in those regions. And just loved the Eastern churches. And he really pushed for this. And so instead of having a Roman Mass every day during the sessions of the council, one of the first big changes was the bishops were exposed to all of the Eastern Catholic churches. And liturgies were held at the high altar in St. Peter's Basilica in the Byzantine, Armenian, Chaldean, Syriac, Syro-Malabar, and so forth. All of those rites. And when it was our turn, the church from Hungary did the liturgy in modern Hungarian. And the church from the United States did the liturgy in modern English. And it was a shock because the other Eastern churches were using classical dead languages. We come forward with modern languages, and that this was acceptable to the popes, to John the 23rd and Paul the VI. It was a big deal, a very big deal. Orientalium Ecclesiarum is the first major document of Vatican II, Eastern churches. And Orientalium Ecclesiarum emphasizes that the Eastern churches are equal in dignity to the Latin church and have an obligation to preach the gospel to all nations. We were forbidden. The native church in India, the Syro-Malabar church, founded by St. Thomas, was forbidden by the Roman hierarchy in India to evangelize until this came out. We were constantly receiving converts in the United States, but it just was not the norm. So you were expected, if you became Catholic, you should become Roman Catholic. That is wiped out, and ordered the restoration of all traditional spiritual and liturgical practices and government, and the Latinization. Diversity within Catholicism is a good thing, and was the first steps to rapprochement with the Orthodox. The Orthodox churches were invited to send observers and delegates, which was a big step forward in dialogue. It's still not fully implemented. Rome has a hard time figuring out how to decentralize. But a lot happened. 1989, of course, is the year of miracles, starting in Poland and then gradually rippling down through the entire continent, down all the way into Bulgaria and Albania. And this, I think, is the best picture to use because here the West Berliners are pulling down the wall, and on the other side are the Vopos, the Volkspolizei, the men who shot people who tried to escape over the Berlin Wall, killed over 60 people. And there they are, and you see these young men, they are completely bewildered. They're just bewildered. What has happened? The reason for their whole country's existence of East Germany disappeared overnight. Just disappeared. And I mean, the people sang the Ode to Joy by Beethoven when the wall was being torn apart. It was just so exciting, for those of us who remember that. You just didn't know what was going to happen next. There was an editorial cartoon I saw of, the sign says cartographer, map makers. And there's a man at a desk, and he's crossing things out on paper and throwing paper away. And then a guy comes up to him and says, "Here, there's more changes." And that's what was happening. And then the big question was, what would happen within the USSR? Well, it was gone. By Christmas Day of 1991, there was no USSR. Russia began its changes, didn't go far enough. In Ukraine, they voted for independence, which was very important. That led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But in Transcarpathia, where our church is headquartered, and in the Eparchy Mukachevo, there was the big question on the ballot, a second question: do you want an autonomous district, where the unique status of Transcarpathia would be recognized? And they voted for that, but it was never granted. Czechoslovakia was dissolved in the Velvet Divorce into two new countries. In Mukachevo, they began to try and regain the churches from the Orthodox. Mixed results, because we often won the court cases since all these churches were built by Greek Catholics. But many times the Russian Orthodox people just refused to pull out. They wouldn't give the church back. Or if they allowed Catholics in to share the church, they would make the Catholic service be celebrated out here at the Tetrapod. And after the Orthodox liturgy, they would lock the doors of the iconostas so that it would not be defiled. So there was a lot of tension there. The Hungarian church had a very successful de-Latinization program that they handled very well. And Yugoslavia, unfortunately, as we know, collapsed into a terrible civil war with awful atrocities. And it did real damage to our church. A lot of parishes suffered. The post-Soviet world in 1992. So the Baltic states got their independence. Belarus became independent, much to their surprise. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then all of the stans in Central Asia. All of the republics got their independence. And then this is, of course, modern Russia. So big changes, which what did Putin say? The end of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. One would say World War II was a much greater disaster. So the expansion of our church in Slovakia, they finally were now able to open new parishes and missions to follow people that had traveled around the country, for work. Bratislava became an eparchy, and Košice became an eparchy. Czech Republic, a new exarchate, was founded in 1996 at Prague. There were about 10,000 Greek Catholics living there at the time from Slovakia, and some even from Transcarpathia. And that's when the immigration in the Czech Republic began from Ukraine. There's a lot of Ukrainian Catholics and Ukrainian Orthodox in Czech Republic, even before the war. In Hungary, new eparchies were founded, and then it became a metropolia. In Yugoslavia, the church had to really rebuild. There was tremendous damage. A lot of people were killed, brutally murdered. Priests were killed. There was great damage. And so the restructuring, once the war ended and new countries' borders were settled, the eparchy of St. Nicholas in Ruski Krstur for Serbia, the original eparchy of Križevci for Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then the Assumption of the Virgin eparchy for Macedonia. So lots of changes that people have had to adapt to, and new borders. All right, so this is Slovakia today. Košice and Prešov, that's the original territory of where the majority of the old parishes were. There were some parishes down this way before World War II, and this is the Bratislava eparchy. But many people were moved out of the traditional areas by the communists to get them away from religious influence and to live in new towns and work in new jobs. And this is where Bratislava has its big growth, opening these new parishes and missions. So this is all mission territory. They have lots of chapels and using Roman Catholic churches. The Hungarian metropolia, this was the traditional settlement area. They are now everywhere. There are Greek Catholics everywhere. There are churches everywhere. There's several parishes in the capital, in Budapest. And they've really grown, and their de-Latinization program was really done well because they took their time with it. They explained things, they catechized, and they saved things that people were very attached to, like the rosary. So it came off pretty good. This is Yugoslavia, how it's changed now. This is one eparchy here in Serbia, which is Hungarians, Russians, Ukrainians. And then here, all of the other republics are Russian, Ukrainians, Croatians, Hungarians, Slovaks, restoring parishes that the communists had shut down, new parishes as well as all the work they had to do to rebuild. So, phenomenal effort on their part. So it's a large church. We are a large church. It's about 1 million faithful when you add all of these people up in Ukraine, in Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia, and Bosnia, Serbia, Czechia, and then we have Hungarian and Slavonic language parishes in Romania. So about 900,000 in Europe, and then the province of the United States. This is Passaic, that's Pittsburgh, this is Parma, and this is Phoenix. And we now have mission in Hawaii. So, and there's missions down here in New Orleans. All over the country there are parishes or outreaches, and people are always writing, asking for priests. So the Byzantine Catholic Church in North America, this is about what we are now. We've dropped a lot. Pittsburgh, Passaic, Parma, Phoenix, Toronto for Canada. In 1949, there were 300,000 faithful in 156 parishes. In 1969, 325,000 people and 213 parishes. Now, 78,000 in 204 parishes. What happened? Where did they go? It's a declining pyramid. Secularization of society, people moving away from religion, the movement out of the old parishes, and ministry did not follow them, a delay in following them to the suburbs, a limited number of priests. There's maybe a dozen guys in the seminary today, and they're not all for our church. They're also from the Ukrainian and Romanian and Melkite Greek Catholic churches. So declining a limited number of priests, assimilation into the Roman Catholic Church, where people moved where there was no parish, it was too far to get to another parish, or they're in a state, like Montana, Wyoming. Those places were abandoned by our church a long time ago because there were not enough priests. There have never been enough priests, ever. Just briefly in those years of the 50s and early 60s. But that was an unusual blip in the United States where there were a high number of vocations to priests and to the convent. That was very unusual in the years after World War II and the Korean War. No evangelization in the changed neighborhoods. There was no outreach. There was no outreach whatsoever to new ethnic groups, to the blacks, to African Americans, no outreach to Puerto Ricans, no wanting, and many times they just weren't welcomed if they came to liturgy. And that was a big mistake, because now we have these gorgeous old churches in a neighborhood where people drive in on Sunday and drive out, and nothing happens during the week, which is really a tragedy. And there's people who need salvation in those neighborhoods. All right, USA, Canada, the eparchy was founded in Toronto specifically as a Slovak eparchy of Cyril and Methodius, and was supposed to be linked to Prešov. That was a mistake, making it an ethnic diocese. The eparchy of Van Nuys for the western states, and Bishop Kuzma, the second bishop in Van Nuys, push away from the ethnic church to becoming a church for all people. That had been happening since World War II, but really moved with official backing under Bishop Dudek and Bishop Kuzma and Bishop Mahalik. They were the ones that could make that adjustment. And they started things like this: the Byzantines for teenagers, restoration of infant Holy Communion, restoration of the permanent diaconate, accreditation finally of the seminary after 53 years. They can grant degrees recognized by the government. Revision of the liturgical books, our own particular law. 2014, the ordination of married men to the priesthood for the first time since 1929. And then Canada was finally linked as a suffragan eparchy or exarchate to Pittsburgh. So it's all one Ruthenian church, which is good because we have this vision of going to all people. Vocations, what happened? Decline of religious orders. It's a huge problem in Western countries, Western Europe and North America. It's a big problem. The Benedictines disappeared, as I said. The Basilian monks left. The few that were there went back to Hungary. Basilian sisters are declining. Different orders are gone completely. But then we have the rebooting of the Carmelites, going under a more Benedictine Cistercian rule that they saw as more Eastern. And the founding of the new monastery in Ohio, Christ the Bridegroom. All young women, all young nuns. Increase in candidacies for the diaconate. The seminary being open to Melkite, Romanian, and Ukrainian churches. But there is a steady decline in the numbers of men applying, even though there is married priesthood. That's not the solution. Everybody thinks, people say in the Roman church, they say, we would get rid of mandatory celibacy. It'll fix the problem. No, it won't. The question is, why are men not responding to the Holy Spirit? That's the question. The Holy Spirit is still calling people. He's still calling men to the priesthood. But something's wrong. Why are they not coming? And then, we started the importing of foreign clergy from Slovakia and Ukraine. But of course, now with the war in Ukraine, that has ended. So relying on importing foreign clergy, it doesn't solve anybody's problems. The answer is here. Why are men not answering? Why are American men not answering God? All right, my house should be called a house of prayer for all peoples, book of Isaiah. All right, this priest wrote this in 1947. Talk about a prediction. It would appear that the future problems of the Byzantine Slavonic Church will be connected not with questions of discipline and right, but with neo-paganism, with the growing indifference to God that is menacing all religion in our generation. 1947, in the United States. He saw what was coming. And we have this mandate from the Holy See. Eastern churches enjoy the same rights and are under the same obligations, also in respect of preaching the gospel to the whole world, everybody. All Eastern Catholic churches have this. It's an obligation. It's an obligation. If somebody is watching this in a territory where your parish doesn't reach out, reach out. Christ did not say build a museum. He said get out there. Baptize all nations. A mission nation. How things have changed. In 2008, the blue areas were areas where a significant number of people said they had no religion. They believed in God, but they had no religion. Look what it is now. It's the whole country. In all of these states that are dark blue, that means you're looking at 35% or more have no church affiliation of any kind. That's a lot of people. And in some of these states, especially in the Pacific Northwest, it's over 50. The only place left are the Dakotas.
Lutherans.
Yep. Heavily Lutheran with a large Catholic minority. That's it. That's it. Everywhere else, it's 30% here in this, even in the Bible Belt. It's 30 to 35% have no religious affiliation in the Deep South. There is a harvest. There is a harvest. And it breaks my heart when I see churches closed. The Roman Catholics are closing churches because they don't have enough priests or not enough people are going to Mass. And we do the same thing. Churches get closed. It's so hard to reopen a church. It's very hard once that church is gone. And you lose people when you close a church. There are people who they're heartbroken over it, or they're angry, or they can't drive, or they can't travel. There's no accessibility for them to get to the new church that they're assigned to. And look at that. And that should be frightening that we're at that level. That's amazing. And all of those people say, they believe in God, presumably the God of the Bible when they say God, but they have no affiliation with anything. Why evangelize? Christ said so. Great Commission. Go forth to all nations and baptize them. America is once again mission territory. The Catholic Church in America was under the direction of the Propaganda Fide, the Office of Missions in the Vatican, until the early 1900s. Well, we may have dioceses everywhere, but we are mission territory. A parish that neglects evangelization will stagnate. It will stagnate and it will decline. Up to 80% of a parish's children will move away. I saw that and I was flabbergasted. But that's because of the mobility of Americans today. 80% of the children in this parish, and we have so many children, up to 80% may end up moving away for work. Perhaps to a city without a Byzantine church. What happens? They switch to another Catholic ritual church, or they leave the faith. They will not automatically replace their parents. Those days they disappeared. Those days have been gone for 40 years. An evangelizing parish is a parish that grows and learns. Grows and learns. Always have to learn. Eastern Christianity is appealing to many moderns. Look at the young adults who come here. The people that have been touched by Cafe over the years, at UNM. The crowd we get on Good Friday night. The extra people who show up on Pascha. It is appealing to many moderns. It really is. And Catholics, all people, they're looking for a welcoming, spiritual home. People want to be welcomed. They want a place that is authentically spiritual, and they want a place where they can feel at home. And there are Catholics who are looking to return to the faith, but they don't even know how. And in a parish, all Byzantine Catholic parishes nowadays are small. Parishes that used to have 3 liturgies only have 1. All of them have the capability of having greeters at the door like we do, and of having people in the pews turn and say, "Hi, can I help you?" And people, welcoming them and inviting them into the hall and having something in the hall instead of just locking the doors 15 minutes after liturgy and the priest goes home. What good is that? That doesn't solve the problem. What do we offer? A history, 1,200 years of continuous worship in a church that started as a church for all nations. Remember when I did the first talk, the multiple nationalities that existed in Europe in the Ruthenian Church. A solid Catholic identity formed by both persecution and misunderstanding. A great liturgy, awesome liturgy, with solid Eucharistic vision. Right? They're talking about the need to teach Roman Catholics about the real presence of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament or in Holy Communion. Gee whiz, we have that. That prayer before communion says it all. And we have a great vision from Scripture and the Fathers. Beautiful chant. People love, young people love. Focused Marian devotion, the Mother of God leading her to her Son. Small, healthy communities. People complain now, especially after COVID. Anonymity of modern society and isolation. You can live in a city of 5 million people and be totally alone. And people brush by in the bus or on the sidewalk or in the train or in the car, especially the car. That's the most isolating thing. At least in the subways or buses, you have some kind of human interaction. You don't when you have 5,000 cars going up and down a highway who just want to get past each other, often with curses. There's too much isolation. There's way too much isolation. Big complaint on campus. When I was in college, there was stuff happening constantly. They're just so cut off. It's awful. We offer the mystery of reconciliation, on Sundays or by appointment. You can't go anywhere, and have your confession heard on a Sunday in a Roman Catholic Church. Why? Because you got one priest trying to juggle 5 masses. He doesn't have time to hear confessions on a Sunday morning. We do. Or by appointment, and we're willing to do that. The personal contact, small community, personal contact with the priest, the deacon, and other lay people. We have so much that we can offer. This is the kind of thing, I put this in because I was sharing this with other clergy. What do you need? You need welcoming greeters, who follow up at the end of the liturgy. The greeter knows who is visiting. The greeter can go back and say, "Please come into the hall. How did you do? Do you have any questions?" Welcoming clergy. Restore the kissing of the cross to meet and greet. Look what Father Artur does. He stands out here sometimes for 15 or 20 minutes, with the kissing of the cross, with people coming up, and he stops and talks to them. An active, up-to-date website. Worst thing in the world, it's Holy Week, and you go to the website, and it has the Christmas schedule. You laugh. You'd be surprised how many churches are like that. They don't have the bulletin. You go for the bulletin. I was just doing this, trying to look up some stuff for the parishes that had our announcement for the bazaar on Saturday, because we sent all these letters out. And I went to this one parish, and the last bulletin they had up was from February. This is April, the end of April. What good is that? You got to have somebody who keeps it up to date. Literature in the entryway, the narthex, a gift shop, especially for Eastern churches. You got to have a gift shop. Because you can't find Eastern Catholic books and icons, in regular bookstores or gift shops. A social hour with food, and that's inviting to visitors, and bring people back. A program in place to incorporate new members into apostolates. Sunday school, adult dad, high school youth, apologetics. An online presence in YouTube and Instagram. The college kids forced me onto Instagram. Michael, I am now following you on Instagram. Nah. Now I know what you're up to. And the use of existing online resources, right? God with Us, Becoming Byzantine. Those are great websites. They have good things there. So, and that is it. So, questions?
Yeah, I'm not a member of the church. I'm not a Catholic, but I can see, I don't have to have anyone to tell me, that this is a successful church.
Oh yeah, this is a successful parish.
So why? Why is this?
I think because we've really worked it. We've really worked at being welcoming. Everybody always says, what a welcoming parish.
I don't see it that way.
That it's not a welcoming parish?
No, you go to any Protestant church, they grab you by the leg,
You haven't been to many Catholic churches, have you?
We went to Catholic churches before we settled here.
And how many people welcomed you and invited you to coffee social?
They welcomed us, but the churches were by and large empty, and they're big and beautiful.
Yeah.
And no, I'm saying that's not for me. It's the liturgy.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing. You have to be rooted.
And you also have 3 very different priests.
Oh yeah, we're unusual having 3 priests
Not
nowadays.
just
Yeah.
3, but I mean they're all unique.
Yep, we are unique, that's for sure.
I don't mean it
I know you mean it nicely, but
in a nice way. Yeah.
I know all 3 of us, we are unique. But it's a real blessing, that we have 3
So
priests.
it's just an accident.
That we have 3? Yeah,
No,
just...
that you're successful.
No, I think it is very much because when I came here, we really had to restart the parish back in '82. And I made a point of explaining what's happening at the altar and why it happens. And I also made a point of telling them, we've got to reach out to others. And it was very much to their credit, because I'll go into this the next time I do this, but in May. The parish at the time had only 3 teenagers in it, and everybody else was older adults. And we had a number of people who had come to America after World War II as refugees, had escaped the communists. And those people were so good about wanting the church to grow and welcoming anyone and explaining things, and I gave them enormous credit. They were fantastic. They were so loving and so kind, and the church just started growing, and in 10 years it was standing room only. We were crammed in the back part there. We were just crammed, and I had 6 or 8 altar servers. We had so many new people coming, and I think that they really took to heart the reality that God loves me and God loves each of us equally, and that we are deeply loved and deeply wanted by God. And that was a message that some of them had never really heard much. It wasn't emphasized, certainly in the 50s and 40s. And they were excited and happy. And they did. They built this church. They built this parish. They really did. The lay people of this parish, they've done a great job.
I think one of the major components, and I'm Roman Catholic, this success of this church is the sense of community.
Yes.
It's amazing to me watching it be on the outside. It's small, compact, very tight, and I miss that from my Roman Catholic side.
And it's hard in a big Roman Catholic parish to have that kind of community and connection because they got, yeah. And then when you consolidate parishes, you know, because there's not enough priests or enough people coming to church anymore in that, you know, when you consolidate parishes, then they just get bigger. And there's a church in Georgia that has 15,000 parishioners. How are they going to have community with 15,000 parishioners? You know, it's a new parish. You know, people have moved there and it's just booming and growing. That, you know, the region is growing. But it's a phenomenal number of people. And it's like 1 or 2 priests in the parish. And what they're doing is breaking it down into small communities, you know, neighborhood communities, in order to get, so that people are not feeling anonymous and isolated. But we're very blessed. You know, one lady told me, she said, you know why I came here? She said, why I stayed? She said, I came here with my baby, and the baby started crying and fussing, and I picked up my purse and the diaper bag in order to leave and go outside, and a woman standing next to me turned to me and said, can I help you with the baby? And she said, Father, for a whole year of that baby, nobody in my parish ever offered to help me, but everybody sure as hell would hiss at me, get out. Here, somebody will say, can I help you? And that makes all the difference. It's a good parish. It's a very good parish.
I'm going to have to give you some credit too, Father Chris.
Well, okay.
For the parish too.
Well, I don't know. People have done a good job. People have done a very good job.
You've done a good job too, Father.
Well, thank you. All right.